By late 1944, the German Tiger tank still dominated open ground, not because it was invincible, but because it enforced distance. It killed at ranges where return fire was impossible. That advantage would not disappear through courage or numbers. It would disappear through physics. This channel examines World War II through the moments when assumptions hardened, decisions narrowed, and history moved forward with fewer options than anyone expected. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. In 1942, the German army did not believe it had built a perfect weapon. It believed it had restored balance. The Tiger I heavy tank was not conceived as a wonder machine, but as a corrective, an answer to a battlefield reality that German planners felt they had already misjudged. The shock had come earlier, during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. German panzer units advancing into the Soviet Union encountered tanks they had not expected to fight in significant numbers, the T-34 and the KV-1. Both were imperfect machines, plagued by mechanical issues and inexperienced crews. But they possessed two qualities that mattered more than refinement: armor that resisted German anti-tank guns, and guns capable of destroying German armor at ranges previously considered safe. For the German armored establishment, this encounter produced a specific lesson. The problem was not merely enemy tanks. The problem was range. Pre-war German doctrine had assumed that battlefield dominance came from coordination, medium tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support operating as a system. The Panzer III and Panzer IV had been designed accordingly. They were not meant to duel enemy armor at long distance. They were meant to support maneuver, break formations, and exploit gaps. Barbarossa exposed a flaw in that logic. When coordination broke down, when infantry lagged, when artillery could not be brought forward quickly enough, German tanks found themselves in direct confrontations they had not been optimized to fight. In those moments, protection and firepower mattered more than maneuver doctrine. The Tiger was born from that realization. Approved in 1942 and entering service later that year, the Tiger I mounted the 8.8 cm KWK-36 gun, derived from the famous anti-aircraft weapon that had already earned a reputation as a tank killer in North Africa and the Eastern Front. Its frontal armor, 100 mm thick, was not sloped like the Soviet T-34s. It did not need to be. At the ranges German planners intended, sheer mass was sufficient. But the Tiger's true strength was not armor alone. It was the creation of a battlefield geometry. German after-action reports and training manuals repeatedly emphasized engagement distance. Tiger units were instructed to fight from prepared positions, hull down when possible, using elevation, optics, and rangefinding to strike first. The 88 mm gun could penetrate Allied tank armor well beyond 2,000 yards. At those distances, most Allied guns could not respond effectively. By 1943, this disparity had hardened into expectation. Allied medium tanks, particularly the American M4 Sherman armed with the 75 mm gun, were optimized for reliability, production scale, and infantry support. They were not designed to fight heavy tanks frontally at long range. American doctrine assumed that tank-on-tank combat would be resolved through combined arms, artillery, tank destroyers, air support, or maneuver, not direct duels. On paper, this made sense. The United States could build tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Reliability and logistics mattered more than individual vehicle superiority. The system would compensate for tactical disadvantages. In practice, the battlefield did not always allow systems to function cleanly. By 1944, American units in Normandy and later in the German border regions began encountering Tigers under conditions that stripped away doctrinal assumptions. Hedgerows, forests, villages, and rolling terrain compressed engagements into narrow corridors. Artillery was not always immediately available. Air support depended on weather and timing. Tank destroyer units were often elsewhere. What remained was Shermans facing Tigers. American tank crews quickly learned the geometry of danger. From the front, at typical combat ranges, the Sherman 75 mm shells struck the Tiger's armor and failed. The impacts were visible. The effect was not. Crews described rounds shattering, deflecting, or leaving scorch marks without penetration. German crews noticed this too. Post-war German accounts repeatedly describe a sense of confidence that settled over Tiger units once engagement range was established. A Tiger positioned on a ridgeline or at the edge of a forest could dominate open ground. It could fire deliberately, select targets, and withdraw if necessary. The enemy, by contrast, had to close the distance under fire. The numbers reinforced the perception. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. A Sherman often needed to approach within 500 yards or less to have a chance at frontal penetration, and even then, success was uncertain. This disparity produced what Allied crews began to describe informally as a safe zone. Beyond a certain distance, the Tiger was effectively immune to frontal attack. Inside that distance, the Sherman became vulnerable not only to the Tiger's gun, but to the time it took to maneuver, aim, and fire. The psychological effect of this geometry mattered. American crews did not panic in the cinematic sense. They followed procedure. They advanced when ordered. They fired when they could. But after action reports reveal patterns, repeated attempts to flank, reliance on smoke, urgent calls for artillery or airstrikes, and frequent disengagements when those supports were unavailable, German crews, by contrast, adjusted their behavior to exploit the range advantage. Tigers avoided close terrain when possible. They waited. They let enemy armor expose itself. They conserved ammunition and selected targets carefully. By late 1944, this pattern had become institutionalized on both sides. American planners knew the Sherman was outmatched in a direct duel with the Tiger. This was not controversial. It was acknowledged in internal memoranda and training material. The accepted solution was not to redesign the tank in the middle of a war, but to manage the encounter through doctrine. That doctrine assumed the Tiger would remain relatively rare, mechanically fragile, and logistically burdensome. All of which were true. But rarity did not eliminate influence. A single Tiger, properly positioned, could delay an advance, inflict losses, and force a unit to reorient its plan. The German army understood this leverage. It used Tigers as mobile strongpoints, not as breakthrough vehicles. Their role was to deny space, to make certain areas prohibitively expensive to cross. As long as the range advantage held, the system worked. But by late 1944, the assumptions underpinning that system were already under pressure. Allied production had not merely matched German output, it had overwhelmed it. American logistical capacity meant new equipment could be introduced, tested, and fielded with speed Germany could no longer match. More importantly, American engineers and ordnance planners had begun to focus on the one variable the Tiger relied on most: engagement distance. They did not seek to out-armor the Tiger. That would take time and weight. They did not seek to outnumber it in the moment of contact. That was unreliable. Instead, they targeted the safe zone itself. If the Tiger's dominance came from killing at 2,000 yards while remaining untouchable, then the solution was not bravery or maneuver. It was to collapse the distance on which that dominance depended. The war, by late 1944, was no longer about whether Germany could win. That question had already been answered by production figures, fuel shortages, and collapsing fronts. What remained was how quickly German formations could be forced to abandon their remaining advantages. The Tiger still ruled open ground. But the conditions that allowed it to rule were narrowing. The map stayed open longer now. Engagement reports were read more carefully. New equipment was arriving at the front. The safe zone was about to disappear. From here on, the geometry of the battlefield would no longer favor the Tiger. By the time American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the solution to the Tiger problem was already taking shape, but it was not yet visible on the battlefield. It existed instead in test ranges, ordnance reports, and engineering debates that had been unfolding for more than 2 years. The assumption that guided American armored development before the war was straightforward. Tanks were not supposed to fight other tanks head-on. That role belonged to tank destroyers, artillery, and aircraft. Tanks were instruments of exploitation and support, not dueling platforms. This belief was not an oversight. It was a doctrine reinforced by interwar studies, staff college instruction, and early wartime experience in North Africa. When American units encountered German armor in 1942 and 1943, the response followed that doctrine. The answer to heavier German tanks was not a heavier American tank, but a layered system, mobility, numbers, and specialized units that could be brought to bear when necessary. That system worked, until it didn't. As German heavy tanks appeared more frequently in Italy and Western Europe, the limitations of doctrinal separation became harder to ignore. Tank destroyer units were not always where they were needed. Artillery could be delayed. Aircraft were subject to weather and timing. And when a Tiger blocked a road, dominated a ridgeline, or covered an approach, the theoretical system collapsed into a practical problem. The problem was distance. American ordnance officers had long understood that penetration was not solely a function of caliber. It was a function of velocity, mass, and impact angle. In controlled conditions, higher velocity rounds consistently produced better results against thick armor, even when caliber differences were modest. This was not new knowledge. What changed was urgency. By 1943, the Ordnance Department was under pressure from combat reports that were becoming increasingly consistent. Shermans were being destroyed at ranges where they could not respond effectively. Flanking maneuvers worked when terrain allowed. Smoke worked when supplies were sufficient. But neither addressed the core imbalance. The question that emerged inside ordnance circles was narrow and technical: how to restore parity at range without abandoning the logistical advantages that defined American armored warfare. The answer was not a new doctrine. It was a gun. The 90mm M3 gun had been under development in various forms since the early years of the war. Originally intended for anti-aircraft use and later adapted for ground combat, it offered a combination of penetration and velocity that exceeded anything currently mounted on American tanks. But the gun alone was not enough. What made the 90mm decisive was the ammunition developed alongside it. High-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, known as VAP, represented a shift in emphasis. Instead of relying solely on mass and explosive filler, VAP rounds used a dense core and extreme velocity to defeat armor through kinetic energy. The physics was simple. At higher speeds, armor behaved less like a barrier and more like a brittle material under stress. The 90mm VAP round left the barrel at approximately 3,350 feet per second. By comparison, the standard 75mm round fired by most Shermans traveled at roughly 2,000 feet per second. The difference was not incremental. It was transformative. At those velocities, armor thickness calculations changed. Angles mattered less. Distance mattered less. What mattered was whether the projectile could arrive intact and fast enough to overwhelm the steel before it could absorb and distribute the impact. American test data from 1944 reflected this shift clearly. Whether Sherman's gun required dangerously close engagement to achieve penetration against heavy German armor, the 90mm could penetrate at ranges that approached those enjoyed by the Tiger itself. This was the critical point. The Tiger's dominance did not come from absolute invulnerability. It came from asymmetric range. It could kill without being threatened. The moment that asymmetry disappeared, the Tiger became something else: a heavy tank with limited mobility, mechanical fragility, and high logistical cost. The decision to mount the 90mm gun on a new heavy tank was not driven by a desire to match German prestige vehicles. It was driven by a recognition that the battlefield had narrowed into direct confrontations where doctrinal separation no longer held. By late 1944, the United States approved the deployment of the M26 Pershing. It was heavier than the Sherman, slower, and more complex. It was not intended to replace the Sherman across the force. It was intended to confront a specific problem. The Pershing was not designed to win the war. It was designed to remove a German advantage that no longer fit the war's trajectory. Internally, American planners were cautious. They did not expect the Pershing to appear in large numbers. They did not expect it to redefine armored warfare overnight. What they expected was narrower and more practical: that when a Tiger appeared, American commanders would no longer have to wait, maneuver desperately, or call for help that might not arrive. They could fire back. This expectation rested on calculations, not confidence. Ballistic tables, penetration curves, and test results were scrutinized repeatedly. The margin for error was small. If the 90mm could not reliably penetrate at extended ranges, the entire premise collapsed. But the data held. By the time Pershings arrived in Europe in early 1945, the theoretical safe zone that had protected Tiger units for nearly 2 years was already gone on paper. The battlefield would now decide whether it had vanished in practice. Once the gun entered the field, distance would no longer belong to the Tiger. The arrival of the first M26 Pershings in Europe in January 1945 did not announce itself with spectacle. There were no massed formations, no sweeping doctrinal changes, no immediate shift in headlines. The Pershings arrived quietly, assigned in small numbers to experienced units, integrated cautiously into formations already shaped by months of attrition. This restraint reflected uncertainty. American commanders understood the theory behind the new tank. They understood the ballistic tables and the test data. What they did not yet understand was how the Pershing would behave under fire, in European terrain, against crews who had learned to exploit every advantage their machines still offered. The Tiger crews, for their part, had not changed their behavior. They had no reason to. By early 1945, the German army was fighting a delaying war across the Western Front. Fuel shortages limited maneuver. Replacement crews were fewer and less experienced. But wherever Tigers appeared, they were still used in the same way: positioned deliberately, controlling ground, enforcing distance. This was not arrogance. It was habit reinforced by years of success. German training emphasized patience. Tiger crews were instructed to fire only when a hit was likely, to avoid unnecessary movement, and to disengage when threatened by artillery or air attack. The tank's strength lay in its ability to shape the engagement before the enemy could react. That logic assumed one constant, that Allied tanks would still need to close dangerously to engage. The Pershing disrupted that assumption almost immediately. Combat reports from February 1945 begin to reflect a subtle but consistent change in language. Where earlier reports described attempts to flank, disengage, or suppress Tigers until heavier support arrived, newer reports note direct engagements at longer ranges. Shots were taken earlier. Positions that would previously have been avoided were now contested. The change was not dramatic. It was procedural. American crews did not rush forward. They did not charge. They did something more telling: they paused, aimed, and fired from distances that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. The Tigers' safe zone had not vanished in a single moment. It eroded. German after-action accounts from the same period reflect confusion rather than alarm. Tigers were being hit at ranges that should have been safe. Penetrations were occurring from frontal arcs previously considered reliable. In some cases, the first indication of danger was the impact itself. There was no immediate reinterpretation. Crews attributed losses to positioning, to enemy luck, to terrain. But as incidents accumulated, a pattern became harder to ignore. The battlefield geometry had changed. The Tigers' advantage had always depended on time as much as distance. Time to observe. Time to range. Time to fire deliberately. The Pershing shortened that time. At extended ranges, a Tiger commander could no longer assume immunity while acquiring a target. If the Pershing could see the Tiger could be engaged. This forced a behavioral shift. German crews began avoiding exposed positions earlier. They relocated more frequently. They withdrew from ridgelines that had previously offered dominance. Engagements became shorter, less decisive, more cautious. These were not doctrinal changes issued from above. They were local adaptations, driven by experience. The Tiger had not become obsolete. But it had become vulnerable in a way it had not been before. The implications extended beyond individual encounters. The Tiger's role as a psychological anchor, a machine that could stabilize a sector through presence alone, weakened. Infantry units that had once relied on Tigers to hold open ground now found those positions contested more aggressively. American advances faced resistance, but not the same paralysis. By March 1945, American armored units no longer treated the appearance of a Tiger as a reason to halt and reorganize. It became a tactical problem rather than an operational one. This distinction mattered. The Tiger had been designed to dominate space. The Pershing did not destroy the Tiger in large numbers. It destroyed the Tiger's control over distance, and with it, the certainty that had defined German armored defense. The collapse was not dramatic. It was incremental. But it was irreversible. Once the safe zone disappeared, there was no doctrinal adjustment that could restore it. Germany lacked the production capacity, fuel, and time to introduce a counter at scale. The war had narrowed too far. From this point forward, Tigers would fight on terms dictated by circumstance, not superiority. The equation that had once favored them no longer held. The distance that had protected the Tiger now worked against it. By February 1945, the Western Front had entered its final phase. The Ardennes counteroffensive had failed in January. German armored reserves were depleted, fuel stocks were critically low, and command structures were strained by constant retreat. What remained of German armored strength was committed piecemeal, often in local counterattacks intended to delay, disrupt, or buy time. It was in this context that the encounter at Elsdorf took place. Elsdorf was not a strategic objective in the conventional sense. It was a village west of Cologne, surrounded by gently rolling terrain, roads, and open fields broken by hedgerows and tree lines. Like many such locations in Western Germany, it sat astride approach routes that mattered less for their intrinsic value than for the time they could deny an advancing force. By late February, American units of the 3rd Armored Division were advancing toward the Rhine. Among them were newly arrived M26 Pershings, assigned cautiously and often paired with more familiar Shermans. Their crews were experienced, but their equipment was still being evaluated under combat conditions. On February 26, 1945, one of these Pershings, later nicknamed Fireball, moved into the area near Elsdorf. The engagement that followed did not begin as a test of doctrine. It began as an ambush. A German Tiger I, positioned deliberately and concealed, opened fire first. The Tiger's crew had executed their task according to established practice: wait, identify, fire. Their shot struck Fireball and penetrated. The Pershing was knocked out. 2 crewmen were killed. From the German perspective, nothing unusual had occurred. A heavy tank had destroyed an enemy vehicle from a prepared position. The system still worked, at least in isolation. But the encounter did not end there. The loss of Fireball triggered a response that would have been unlikely earlier in the war. Instead of halting the advance or waiting for artillery and air support, American commanders ordered another Pershing forward. This second Pershing did not approach recklessly. It advanced deliberately, using terrain and observation. When it located the Tiger, the engagement unfolded quickly. The Pershing fired first. The 90mm round struck the Tiger's frontal armor. It penetrated the hull. Inside the German tank, ammunition detonated. The Tiger was destroyed. There was no prolonged duel. No exchange of fire. No drawn-out maneuver. The engagement ended in seconds. Post-war accounts from American units described the incident with restraint. It was noted as confirmation rather than revelation. The Pershing had performed as expected. The gun had done what the calculations said it would do. German records, where they exist, do not dwell on the encounter. There was no time for analysis. By February 1945, German armored units were engaged continuously, retreating under pressure, absorbing losses without the opportunity to reinterpret them fully. But the symbolism of Elsdorf mattered. For the first time in the Western Front, a Tiger had been destroyed frontally by an American tank at a range that did not require flanking, sacrifice, or external support. The safe zone was not merely theoretical anymore. It was gone in practice. The encounter did not change the course of the war. It did not alter strategic outcomes. What it did was confirm that the Tiger's defining advantage no longer functioned reliably. From that point forward, Tiger commanders could no longer assume that distance equaled safety. The very behavior that had kept them alive, holding ground, selecting targets deliberately, enforcing space, now exposed them to a weapon designed specifically to negate that behavior. The Predator had not become weak. It had become visible. After Elsdorf, the Tiger could still fight. But it could no longer dominate. After Elsdorf, nothing about the Tiger tank changed on paper. Its armor thickness remained the same. Its gun retained its lethality. Its crews continued to train, fight, and adapt. Yet across the Western Front in March 1945, Tiger units began to behave differently, not because of orders, but because experience had narrowed their options. This was the critical shift. The Tiger had never been designed to chase. It was designed to deny. Its purpose was to make certain terrain unusable to the enemy, to impose cost before contact, and to slow advances through fear and attrition. All of that depended on one condition: the ability to remain exposed long enough to control space. By early 1945, that condition no longer held. German unit logs and post-war memoirs describe a growing reluctance to occupy dominant ground unless absolutely necessary. Ridge lines were approached cautiously. Open fields were crossed quickly rather than observed from. Firing positions were abandoned sooner than doctrine had once recommended. These were not acts of panic. They were acts of recalculation. When a Tiger commander could no longer assume that frontal armor and distance would absorb the first incoming shot, every engagement became compressed. Observation time shortened. Target selection accelerated. Withdrawal occurred earlier. The Tiger began to fight like a heavy medium tank, not a battlefield anchor. This had cascading effects. Infantry units that once relied on Tigers to stabilize sectors found those sectors less stable. American armored units advanced more aggressively, not because they believed Tigers were gone, but because they believed Tigers could be answered. The presence of the Pershing did not need to be widespread to matter. It only needed to be possible. American operational planning documents from March 1945 reflect this subtle change. Tigers were still noted as threats, but no longer treated as automatic engagement stoppers. The language shifted from avoidance to mitigation. Routes were planned with the expectation of resistance, not paralysis. The Tiger's reputation had not vanished. But reputation without immunity had limits. German planners had no meaningful response available. A heavier Tiger variant, the Tiger II, existed, but its numbers were small, its mechanical reliability worse, and its fuel requirements unsustainable. New guns or ammunition could not be fielded at scale. The industrial base required to restore the range advantage no longer existed. The war had narrowed beyond correction. By April 1945, Tigers still fought in isolated engagements, still destroyed Allied vehicles, still imposed losses. But they no longer shaped the battlefield. They reacted to it. The distinction was decisive. The Tiger had been designed to make the enemy solve a problem. Now, the Tiger itself was the problem being solved. What the Tiger could no longer do was decide the terms of engagement. In the years after the war, the Tiger tank acquired a reputation that often obscured the reality of its decline. Memoirs, photographs, and post-war fascination elevated it into a symbol of German engineering prowess and battlefield dominance. In isolation, those qualities were real. What was less often acknowledged was how narrowly that dominance depended on a single assumption: distance. The Tiger ruled as long as it could enforce range. When that assumption collapsed, the tank did not fail catastrophically. It became ordinary, heavy, demanding, constrained. The M26 Pershing did not defeat the Tiger through numbers or maneuver. It did not overwhelm German crews through tactical brilliance. It removed the Tiger's advantage by violating its geometry. The 90mm gun did not make the Pershing invincible. It made the battlefield symmetrical. Once both sides could kill at similar distances, the Tiger's disadvantages became unavoidable. Its weight limited mobility. Its complexity strained maintenance. Its fuel consumption restricted movement. These had always been present. They simply had not mattered before. By early 1945, they mattered. Post-war American analysis treated the Pershing cautiously. It was not hailed as a war winner. It was described as a necessary correction. German post-war reflections, where they addressed the issue directly, often focused on logistics and air power rather than armor parity. But between the lines, the implication was clear. The Tiger had lost its margin. World War II repeatedly demonstrated that dominance built on a single advantage rarely survives contact with adaptation. Doctrines harden. Assumptions persist. Systems optimize for yesterday's conditions. Then a variable shifts, often quietly, and the structure collapses without drama. The end of the Tiger's reign was not marked by a final battle or a decisive order. It ended when distance stopped protecting it. What this revealed was not the failure of German engineering, but the limits of certainty in war. The Tiger was designed for a battlefield that no longer existed by the time it mattered most. History did not remember that moment clearly. But the battlefield did. And by the time it was understood, there was no space left to recover. If you've made it this far, you understand that history isn't decided in a single moment. It's shaped by timing, hesitation, and the decisions people make when options begin to close. If this perspective speaks to you, consider subscribing for future episodes. As the war itself would prove, once events are set in motion, they rarely wait for permission.